Super. So, welcome back, everybody. And tonight we have not only our third meeting together, but our first really experimental meeting. The Venerable Gendun and I are going to try co-teaching this evening, something that we've never done before, but we've hung out enough that we think we can probably pull it off. So it's going to be Dharma teaching improv time. We have not rehearsed this. We have not even really planned it, but we're just going to see what happens. Could degenerate badly, but I don't think so. Anyway, no. I want to remind you all of where we are. Last time we spent our time on the Gunaprabha chapter 6, where we introduced the three natures. And we saw that in the Saṃdhinirmocana, one of the things that the Buddha does is to give us a positive account of the nature of things that correspond, that is kind of a bookend or a mirror image of the negative account in terms of emptiness that we generally find in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. But having seen that positive account in terms of the three natures, and that of course you'll remember with the imagined nature, the dependent nature, and the consummate nature, that raises an important question, an obvious question. And that is the question that Paramartha Samudgata begins the great 7th chapter with. So I'm going to channel Paramartha Samudgata right now, and we're going to see how that question arises and why it arises.
Which also, by the way, is an interesting point is this guy's name, because his name, of course, means having arisen from the ultimate, or from the consummate.
Yes, having completely arisen from the ultimate. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. The names are kind of wonderful in this text. So he says, "Hey Buddha, I was thinking, you've spoken many ways of the nature of things like the psychophysical clusters. And you've spoken about the fact that they're produced, the fact that they disintegrate, the fact that we need to abandon them in order to realize. And you've also spoken not only about these clusters, but about the sense spheres, about dependent origination and so forth. And you've talked about the Four Noble Truths and all of that stuff. You've said all of that, but you've also said that everything lacks any essence and lacks any nature, and that all phenomena are unproduced, that they're unceasing, that they're completely pacified and naturally in a state of nirvana." Now, this is where we're really following up on that previous chapter, right? And he says, so I thought, what in the world was the Buddha thinking when you said everything lacks any nature, that phenomena are unproduced, unceasing, pacified from the start, and naturally in nirvana? What in the world could you have been thinking? So I want to ask you what this means. So what we see here is Paramartha Samudgata, raising the obvious question that arises after the Buddha has told, Gunaprabha about the positive nature of things. He's saying, but what did you mean when you said everything was empty, if they've got these three natures? And so that's what we're going to be looking at right now. And what we're going to discover is that corresponding to each of those three positive natures is a kind of emptiness. And so it's not only the case that everything has three natures, but also that everything is empty or natureless in three different ways corresponding to those. And this is really, I think, one of the subtlest points of Yogācāra philosophy. The fact that when we say that things have these natures, it might sound as though we're reinstating non-emptiness in something positive. Yeah. But what we see here is that that's not a way of reinstating that. Rather, what it is a flip side of three kinds of emptiness. And so the Buddha says, hey, Paramartha Samudgata, I was thinking about three kinds of absence of essence in phenomena. Absence of essence in terms of characteristic, absence of essence in terms of production, and ultimate lack of essence. That's why I taught everything lacks any essence, lacks it in these three different ways. And now the Buddha begins to spell out each of those ways. Before we go into that, I want to make sure we do a little bit of review, because none of these is going to make any sense if we don't remember clearly what each of the three natures is, because we're trading on that analysis right now. Now, one thing we could do is give you a pop quiz and ask anybody who fails the quiz to drop out of the course, but we're not that mean. So instead, we're going to give you the answers to the pop quiz, okay? The first of the three natures was what we called the imagined nature. And the imagined nature of things is the way we naively take things to be in ordinary perception. And that involves the superimposition of subject-object duality, but it also involves the assumption, what I called the other day, following Husserl, the natural attitude, the natural assumption that when we experience things, they exist just as we experience them. So for instance, right now, I'm looking at this wonderful picture of Gendun on the screen up against this gorgeous background from Burma. And as I look at him, I say, wow, Gendun is in Burma. Not only that, I say that Gendun's robe is really as red as it appears, and the trees behind him are really as green as they appear. And why do we call that an imagined nature? Because we know that those properties aren't in the things themselves. Those arise as a result of whatever is happening in my visual system. I create those colors. I create those images. So what I'm seeing is not Gendun as he is and Burma as it is. Rather, I'm seeing Gendun and Burma as they show up on my computer screen as filtered through my eyes and my perceptual and cognitive faculties. So to say it's an imagined nature is to say everything I experience there is something that I'm constructing. Gendun, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I thought there's something interesting to add to this that actually was highlighted by one of the participants in your previous conversation, is that and when we will talk later about this being conceptualized and categorized, that the word that is being used here are conventionalities. Yeah. So it's not only a by-effect of our physiological and psychological makeup, but it is also something that we do in between each other.
Yes.
We create our worlds in which we exist, in which parts interconnect, some parts do not interconnect. Because I think one of the interesting things that Yogācāra does with the interplay between the imaginary and the dependent nature is also giving a grounding argument for compassion. Yes. On the one hand, you could fall into the trap of believing that the imagined nature exists as it appears, but you can also sort of look slightly through it and realize that the imagined nature is a collective construction. And so it shows something about how we interact. It also overcomes, of course, the risk with Yogācāra that it might lead to a form of solipsism. Absolutely. And so by understanding that the appearance is a conventional construction and that words and concepts can only be socially navigated, that it provides equally immediately not only the basis of removing something that creates afflictions, but also provides immediately something that a future Buddha might use to draw other beings close and act towards them.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. And the imagined nature, of course, as we said the other day, it's parikalpita. It's something that we do. We imagine, we construct both collectively and individually. The second nature is the paratantra. That's not a construction. That's a nominal that's a nominal. So the paratantra is the dependent nature of things. The fact that what things really are is just a causally conditioned flow of events related by interdependence, related by causality, related by mereology, that is a part-whole relation, and related by our cognitive processes. So that when I'm seeing Gendun on the screen, what's really happening is light is bouncing, is leaving my screen, entering my retina, causing things to happen in my on the back of my retina, causing electrical impulses to go into my occipital cortex and all that stuff. And when I categorize Gendun as a person in front of a background in Burma, All of that has to do with the concepts and words that we construct together in order to understand that. So that when I understand the dependent nature of things, I'm understanding that fundamentally my experience is not dual. It's not me, the subject, standing against Gendun, the object. It's a complicated causal interplay in which there is no subject-object duality, just a lot of causation. Gendun?
So if Jay this evening does a good job, I will actually disappear from the screen and there will be nothing but a signless black screen on the, yes. But it's interesting nevertheless that indeed it's not only limited to color and hardness and so on and so forth, but it's even the thing making, the way we categorize the world, because the Majanta Vibhaga, for example, clearly states that within the alaya there is the imprints for perceptions, but also for words and language and how these interact.
Yeah.
See, very good Theravada text on this is Bhikkhu Bodhi's commentary on the first sutra of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Mullapariyaya Sutta, where he highlights how our conceptuality, our prapancha, interacts with our discernment or mental factor of perception. And so how we take the data in a way, in such a way, as some neurologists would say, we don't see the world, we recognize the world rather. So we use pre-existing structures in order to construct the world.
Yeah.
That's always also the problem a little bit with discussing this whole thing, I always think, because with every word that we say, we also are self-defeating ourselves.
Exactly.
Because when we say the sensory apparatus, we are thing-making.
Yeah.
So it obscures as much as it illuminates.
Now, I do see the two hands that are raised, and I do plan to come to them, but I want to finish the three natures before we do that and then come to all questions about those together. So I'm not ignoring the two questions that I see, the one from Suvash and the one from B. We'll get to them in a moment, don't worry. But the third nature, it's another pari nature, another past participle, and that's the parinishpana, the consummate nature. And when we consummate our understanding, what we see is that paratantra, that dependent nature, is empty of being the way we imagine it. That one really is a negation. That one really is saying that if I really understand the nature of the image of Gendun that I have, what I understand is that it's just a causal process and does not have the characteristics that I assign to it. One way of putting that is it's the deep recognition that I am constructing this world. I'm not simply receiving it. And that as I construct it in an embedded, enacted, causal embedding in the world, rather than as somebody standing against it as subject, constructing it as object. And so those are the three natures: an imagined nature, a dependent nature, and a consummate nature. And the imagined and the consummate are each two different ways, or each a different way of taking the dependent nature. If the dependent nature is the world of dependent origination in which we live, we can imagine it to be characterized by subject-object duality and to be delivered to us just as it is. Or we can develop a complete understanding in which we evacuate the dependent nature of those characteristics.
No, completely correct. In a moment, and that might be nice to intersect as well in between, is that although this process of understanding this is pretty hard to do, it takes a lot of cultivation. What we later on will be interesting to explore as well a little bit is that the process of the generation of calm abiding actually mimics the process, where without applying the direct antidote, but simply knowing the disadvantage of that misunderstanding gradually calms the mind and makes the mind ever peacefuler of the signs that otherwise take us by our nose. So at one point when we talk about the three essences, that might be something interesting to interject, because this is more straightforward, I would say, to experience. where a measure, for example, of object-subject duality is not out of our reach, where the ultimate removal of object-subject duality is, we'll see if we manage in this life.
Yes, rather harder than it sounds. Harder than it
Yes.
sounds. Let me pause now to take these two questions. First, Suvansh.
Professor Garfield, thank you. You know, in the interim since last week, I've been reading Longchenpa's description of the three natures in Finding Rest in the Nature of the Mind. And one of the things that he says over here, which I realized that, you know, I was not thinking about this correctly, is he says that in the description of the dependent nature, he says, all these things are but the full development of the habitual tendencies of the mind. So he's saying that the dependent nature, right, is a function of the habitual tendencies. So that means, which actually surprised me a little bit, it means that even between human beings, right, when we look at a phenomena, that phenomena's dependent nature, okay, is different based on our habitual tendencies.
Absolutely.
And I think it becomes clear when I think of, you know, myself as looking at it as opposed to a dog or a cat looking at it, right? So I can see that play in. But even, I mean, just the fact that the dependent, I was thinking that the imputed nature is a function of the habitual tendencies, but in fact, he says it's the dependent nature.
They both are, and in slightly different but deeply connected ways. And so let me say a couple of things and then ask Gendun to say a couple of things. The first couple of things I want to say is this. Last week, if you'll remember, or maybe the week before, I talked about two very different ways that Yogācāra tradition is often read, sometimes as idealist and sometimes as phenomenological. And we can read what Longchenpa is doing in either of those ways. So if we read it in an idealistic way, then what Longchenpa is doing is emphasizing that on which our experience is dependent is the maturation of potentials in the Alaya Vijnana. That would be, for instance, very consistent with the way Dignaga puts it in Alambana Pariksha. So that would be reflecting on the ongoing evolving process of potentials in the Alaya Vijnana ripening with subject-object duality. And so when we look at the causal process, it's a causal process that's entirely cognitive. But there's also a very rich phenomenological way that we can read what Longchenpa is talking about. The point that he's making is that just as the imagined nature depends upon each of our minds and our faculties, the dependent nature being the kind of set of causal processes that delivers our experience has to include cognitive processes, perceptual processes, as well as external causal processes. The very phenomenology of perception is the phenomenology of the interaction of us as organisms with the rest of the environment in which we function. And each of us brings different things to our experience. Sometimes our mood or our emotions affect the way that we experience things. The languages that we speak affect the way that we experience things. Our conceptual constructs, or maybe our political views do. So that when we look at the causal process that leads to the imagined nature, that's going to be slightly different for each of us. It's also important to notice there will be huge overlaps. So while my causal processes and your causal processes are going to differ in some ways, they're also going to overlap in ways in which neither of our causal processes overlap with those of my dog. And so we do get a shared human world, but it's not perfectly shared human world. It's a complex overlap of worlds that constitutes together the loka that we inhabit. Gendun, did you want to say more about that?
Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh actually puts it in a very interesting way. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a commentary on the 20 and 30 verses by Vasubandhu, and he says something very interesting, which there's a lot of there to unpack. He says, the imprints in the alaya are neither individual nor social, nor communal. They are both. You cannot separate. It's like in a dance. You cannot dance without the other person. So you cannot separate your individual intentionality from the intentionality of others. Our intentionality happens in between others. And because of that, we share, and there's also regularly mismatches.
Yep.
Actually, recently a book appeared by the great scholar Sonam Kachru, Other Lives, in which he explores exactly this question. Beautiful book where he explores exactly that notion. He uses the examples of Vasubandhu in his 30 verses on dream and so on and so forth. But I think the more important part is where he describes, especially in our very polarized time, how it is possible that different beings might have such immensely different perceptions. Because I think it does two things. It, like in political discourse, it allows us to give some leeway that we might not understand at all what the other person is seeing. That's the famous question, like, can you imagine what a bat sees? And the answer is actually mostly no. But somehow the fact that our worlds are interconnected does also provide us with a way to navigate it. I think also an important point is that when you look at it from the perspective of Buddha nature literature, is that the alaya does indeed, as an aspect of the dependent nature, contains both the seeds for our afflictions and our knowledge obscurations, but also the seeds for our understanding and our future freedom. So the dependent nature is the basis for both, and luckily they are part of the dependent nature, because otherwise they would be self-existing, and self-existing afflictions you would be unable to remove.
Okay. Thank you.
B, your question.
I missed class last week, but I watched the recording. So I have a few questions actually. A couple quick clarification before I get to my main question. So when we say nature, it is referring to phenomena, right?
It's referring to the characteristic or the essence of the phenomena.
Okay. In the famous teaching of the three beings seeing three type of fluids while looking at the same bowl of fluid.
Yep.
So water for human and blood and pus for hungry ghosts and nectar for God.
Yep.
So for each of those fluid, are they the imagined nature or dependent nature for each of the being?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way to put that is that each of those is the imagined nature of those things. So when I see what's in that bowl as water, I imagine that that's just the nature of that stuff. That's what it is, independent of who I am. When a preta sees it, they see it as pus and blood, independently of who they are. When a deva or a deity sees it, they see it as ambrosia. But in each of those cases, what we neglect is to see that the way that it shows up for us depends as much on our own cognitive, perceptual apparatus, karma, and so forth, as anything there. And the dependent nature of that is that whole causal process by means of which it comes to show up that way. And when we spell out that whole process, pus and blood aren't there, water isn't there, ambrosia isn't there. Those are the ways that it manifests.
And here where these beings do share, you can see where they do share common aspects in their dependent origination is that they all see a fluid, interestingly enough. So there is a point where they separate, where they belong to, one could say, polarized groups by karma. And at the same time, there's also an aspect of their worlds that they share. They see all three of fluid. They have a very different relation to the fluid.
And remember, as I said last week, you don't need to go to anything as exotic as pretas and deities to get this going. If we just imagine the way my dog sees a flower, the way I see the flower, and the way a bee sees a flower, they will appear completely differently. And if we ask the question, what is the flower really like? Who gets it right? There's no answer to that. I get it right for how flowers show up for humans. My dog gets it right for how flowers show up for dogs. And the bee gets it right for how flowers show up for bees. We operate in 3 different lokas, but those lokas overlap. There's still something in front of us that we all see.
I thought that this morning in the when I was walking through the Prospect Park, because you have this beautiful green meadow, and I see something to lie into.
Yeah.
And the dog that walks around me sees a toilet.
Yeah.
The cow would see a plate of food, and a polar bear would see hell because it's way too warm for him.
Exactly.
And we're all in the same place, but we see very different places.
That's right. And when you think about that in terms of our karma, the karma is just our collective evolutionary, cultural, psychological, biological history. You don't have to do anything very mystical to understand that. Our history determines what we experience as much as what's in front of us.
I think that's actually a very important point, because the mystification of karma is a major obstacle for misunderstanding practices. Yeah.
I think that's right.
Okay, pardon me for being very much trained by Lama Tsongkhapa. So from the Lama Tsongkhapa, from Madhyamaka perspective, we would say that when I look at an apple, however it appears to me is my conventionality. And of course, then there's a superimposition on the apple for being truly assistant. Or from a Chittamatra point of view, from a Yogācāra point of view, there's a superimposition of the apple being separate from my mind that is perceiving it. But nevertheless, there is an apple, however we want to characterize it, versus like sky flower. There's no sky flower, but there is an apple in front of me. So from the way you are explaining Imagine Nature, how would I differentiate between an actual conventionality and a total non-existence?
That's a longer story, and that depends a little bit on our analysis of pramana. Of course, Tsongkhapa is going to give us a very different answer from the answer that we find in, say, Dignaga or Vasubandhu. But that's really not what we were working on last time. We were working on the 3 natures themselves.
Okay, from phenomenological point of view, how do I differentiate an apple in front of me and sky flower?
Well, because a sky flower in front of you is something, A, that nobody else in the room is going to see. So let's just talk about the whole pramana issue, right? Something that is conventionally real is something that is presented by healthy, functioning faculties, that is not undermined by other healthy pramanas, and that is not undermined by ultimate analysis. The sky flower is undermined by healthy pramanas. So you say, hey, I see a sky flower in front of me. Gendun and I both say, you need some sleep. There's no sky flower there. Or you've got to stop drinking so much. There's no sky flower there. Whereas if you see an apple, we say, yeah, there's an apple there. And let's confirm it by reaching out and touching it and tasting it. Multiple different pramanas give us that apple. But no healthy pramana gives us the sky flower. But again, what we're not doing now is really talking about pramana theory. It's not that this isn't a reasonable thing to talk about. It's that it's not what the topic is of the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra. And so it's not going to take us into the 3 natures and the 3 naturelessnesses.
Okay, by that explanation, there is an apple. However, when we talk about Imagine Nature, there are 2. One is assistant and one is non-assistant. So when you say an apple, or from last week, the red color being Imagine Nature, are you referring to the assistant Imagine Nature or non-assistant Imagine Nature?
I'm sorry, the assist, I must be mishearing you.
Something that exists, something that is there, and something that's not there.
Oh, existent imagined nature. The imagined nature very much exists, and that's an important part. When we
So
talk
there's
about these,
no-
let me finish the
Imagine
sentence. The imagined nature very much exists, but it exists as an imagined projection. So to say that there's a red apple in front of me is true in one sense. Well, it's not true now, I took the apple away, but if it were here, that would be true in one sense. But to say that the redness of the apple and the apple itself are independent of my cognitive processes and my perceptual processes, to say that they're just there and I detect them, that's what's imagined. That's completely imaginary. The dependent nature, the causal process that's generating for me the perception of the apple is real, but it's empty of any of the qualities that I assign to the apple. Those aren't there. There's nothing red inside my head. There's nothing red on the back of my retina. All there is a very complicated causal process that results in the construction of a red apple. The confusion of the imagined nature with the dependent is the confusion of something I've constructed with something I've just found.
When we are talking about my confusion of the apple being not being separate from my mind, that is non-existent from a
Yeah,
yoga
that's right.
point of view.
That's right.
So that is not that. To be more precise, is that the imagined nature you are referring to, or you are referring to the apple itself being imagined nature? Or is it the appearance of the apple being separate from my mind? That is imagination.
That is part of the imagined nature. Subject-object duality is part of the imagined nature. It's a central part.
But you're saying the apple is also an imagination.
The fact that the
apple has
appearance
three
appears
natures.
is exactly, yeah. The fact that the apple appears is dependent nature. So the fact that there is an appearance is existent. And so the Madhyamaka again plays with regard to the three nature every time there's existent and non-existent thing. So it says with regard to the imaginary nature, the imaginary nature exists. It is a dependent arising phenomenon. But it adds an aspect to our awareness that under analysis turns out not to exist at all. For example, that the apple exists independently from the perceiver of the apple.
B, I'm going to ask you to shelve this question until next week, because next week we're going to be reading the Trisvabhāvanirdeśa, the treatise on the three natures. And there Vasubandhu very precisely distinguishes the way in which each nature exists and does not exist, the way each one is dual and non-dual, the way each one is perceived and not perceived. And I think your questions will be better answered in that context rather than in the Saṃdhinirmocana, where those are not the questions that we're addressing. And if we stay on this, we're never going to get through the Saṃdhinirmocana, so we're going to move. Okay, so we've now given you the answers to the pop quiz. You now know what the three natures are, and we can come back to Paramartha Samudgata. And so the Buddha says to Paramartha Samudgata, and here I'm on page 99 in the English, 98 in the Tibetan. He says, hey, Paramartha Samudgata, I was thinking of three kinds of lack of nature, three kinds of emptiness and phenomena. Emptiness in terms of characteristic, emptiness in terms of production, and ultimate emptiness. Thinking of those three kinds of emptiness, I said everything lacks any nature. So again, we've had three natures, now we're going to have three emptinesses, and they're going to match one to the other. So the Buddha begins, he says, so Paramartha Samudgata, what is emptiness in terms of character or characteristic? It is the imagined nature. Now notice what we've just done. We've identified the imagined nature with a kind of emptiness, an emptiness in terms of characteristic. That's very powerful because what's happening is we're responding to the obvious objection where the Buddha has already said everything is empty and lacks any character. And then in the last chapter, he says, oh, by the way, they have 3 characters. And now what we're doing is resolving that tension by showing that each of those apparently positive characters is in fact a negative, an absence of any essence. So he says, why is this? That is, why is the imagined nature the emptiness with respect to characteristic? Because the imagined nature is posited through names and symbols, but does not exist through its own nature. Therefore, it is an emptiness in terms of characteristics. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that if we pay attention to the nature of the imagined nature, that is how things show up for us, and we really understand them as imagined, what that is to understand that the things themselves lack the characteristics we attribute to them, that they are empty of those characteristics. That's why to say in a positive way, it's an imagined nature, is to say in a negative way that it lacks any of those characteristics as its own nature, as an essence. They're coming from our side. Gendun?
Yeah, I was thinking there's actually an interesting analogy coming from Donald Hoffman. I think he's a philosopher that compares this tension between what we see on our desktop of our laptop and what is going on behind it. Although that duality does not entirely work, but when we throw a file into the garbage bin, none of us fall into the belief, into the illusion that there's actually a garbage bin somewhere in our computer and an existing file. But from the perspective of the deluded being, there is truly a garbage bin and a file that we make disappear into that garbage bin. And so you could say what is behind there is the dependent origination. The dependent nature also produces, in fact, the screen that we are looking at.
Yeah.
But so the screen as it appears to us is existing, but the characters by which it is defined, as in files and garbage bins and so on and so forth, that thing ultimately is not existing at all.
Absolutely. And we can also reflect on the fact that when we're looking at the screen, as I am right now, we feel as though we're looking right through the screen at objects. So I've got the feeling that I'm actually staring at Gendun right now, seeing him, seeing Burma behind him, seeing those earpieces in his ears, and so forth. And it doesn't feel to me that what I'm seeing is a bunch of phosphenes on a screen caused by a lot of electrical activity happening behind, except that that's what's happening.
And also what remains important, I think, to highlight, at least to sort of qualify our language, that is very much what it also says here, that what we perceive is very much navigated by our conceptuality and our language.
Yeah.
Because I think always the problem is the moment we introduce these analogies, and we will see later on in the next week with regard to the analogy of the magician.
Yeah.
This is very easy to misunderstand as referring to something self-existing, remaining somehow. And it is important, I think, to keep highlighting that an aspect of the categorization that we seem to observe the world in as independently existing things at all is simply a byproduct of dependently arisen concepts and words.
And it might help us, even before we go to the second of the 3 emptinesses, to step back to a much larger context. And that's the context of pervasive illusion and what Yogācāra is doing for that. This is, again, something that we talked about on the first night, but it's worth remembering, that it's fundamental to a Buddhist analysis of experience that the root of suffering is a pervasive illusion. And that pervasive illusion is the illusion of intrinsic reality, the illusion that the things that we see actually have the essences they appear to, actually stand as independent, substantial things. And that's a pervasive illusion. That's something that we experience constantly, all the time. Madhyamaka gives us an analysis of why it's an illusion. It explains why phenomena are empty of intrinsic identity. It does not give us an analysis of how we come to construct the illusion. Yogācāra is giving us that psychological, phenomenological analysis of the construction of the illusion. How is it that I come to see empty phenomena as though they're not empty? How is it that I come to see a world in which I'm embedded as a world against which I stand as subject to object? How do I do that? How do I conjure up a non-existent reality out of an existent dependent origination? That's what we're talking about right now. And when we see that the characteristics that we ascribe to things are only imagined to be those things, then we're seeing that they are in fact empty of those, but experienced as having them. And that's the beginning of an understanding of the nature of illusion. Always keep that in mind. All of this is about the nature of illusion and how it is that we construct and get completely sucked in by that illusion.
It's also maybe good to add here that, because we can say that in a very abstract way, but I think it's also important to investigate what that does to us, because to some sense, you could say the qualification of the effectiveness of this philosophy is to the extent that it can alleviate our suffering.
Yeah.
And one of the things, for example, that we add to the apple is that it has intrinsically a pleasant taste.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are fooled by that seemingly, that taste that seems to be from the side of the object, rather than something that exists between us. As a mammal, when I'm hungry, the apple is capable of sustaining me into the future. And that is what is happening. But the misconception of the imaginary nature makes me believe that the pleasant aspect abides in the apple, and makes the apple, by that very fact, a dissatisfactory object, because it cannot sustain that happiness. And so the analysis that the Yogācāras give of that object subject duality, where we believe that that quality is in and of itself to be found in the object, tricks us into behaving in very unskillful ways towards apples in this case.
It gets even worse because it leads us to behave in unskillful ways towards one another and towards sentient beings in general. Because the moment we superimpose this kind of subject-object duality, we take ourselves out of the world as subjects experiencing the world. And then between me and you becomes a gulf between the subject and a whole bunch of objects. And the moment I objectify people around me, they become instruments. They become objects among objects. And the moment I distance myself as subject, I take myself out of the world in which I live. My teacher, Geshe Topka, used to remind all of us, every syllable of Buddha Dharma is about ethics. And so when we think about these three natures, we want to remember that in the end, they're about ethics. It's one thing to think of myself as operating on the world out of my own desires. It's another thing to experience myself as an interdependent part of the world. It's one thing for me to see you as an object. It's another thing for me to see us as co-constituting subjects.
It also, of course, creates, and that's just a way to state the same thing, it creates this pervasive sense of alienation. Interestingly, both from ourselves, as we experience ourselves also as objects. When our own mind or our own body appears to us, it appears as other, it appears as being separated from the self, and we utilize our own body and mind in very unskillful ways because of that same reason. And we become separated, alienated from the society, the world that we are embedded in.
Now, Richard, I do see your hand, but I want to get us through the three natures initially before we come back to you. Okay, is that all right? Otherwise, the sidetrack will get too long. So the second thing that the Buddha says here, he says, "So Paramartha Samagana, what is emptiness in terms of production?" He says that is the other dependent nature. So again, on the positive side, the other dependent nature is the nature of things. On the negative, the emptiness side, it's emptiness in terms of production. Why is this? That's because the other dependent nature arises through the power of other conditions and not by itself. That's why it's emptiness in terms of production. So that when we see that, remember, these are all natures of things. So when we see the conditioned or the produced other dependent nature of things, we are seeing the fact that they are empty because they don't have an essence of their own, but come into being dependent upon countless causes and conditions and disappear when those causes and conditions cease to be in place. So that, again, just as the Paratantra Svabhava is something that can be seen in different ways, we now see that the kind of emptiness the Paratantra Svabhava has is emptiness in terms of being conditioned, not in terms of what we impute to it. So it's a slightly different kind of emptiness, but it's still an emptiness. And then third, he says, so Paramartha Samadgana, what is the ultimate emptiness of phenomena? It says things that are dependently originated lack any essence because of the essencelessness in terms of production. They also are ultimately empty. Why? Whatever, now here's a very beautiful phrase, whatever is an object of observation for purification is the ultimate. Now, so that is when we talk about he's playing with paramartha here, highest object. To be the highest object is to be something which, when you apprehend it, is an object of purification, helps you purify your vision. It says the other dependent nature is not the object of purification. And because it's not an object of purification, then this absence is what the ultimate nature is. That is the absence of the imagined in the dependent. It's that absence, the fact that the dependent nature lacks what we attribute to it in the imagined nature, is the ultimate emptiness of phenomena. Gendun, did you want to continue on this one?
I think it's a very important point. To some extent, it relates back to one of the earlier questions about the fact that the dependent nature is both the producer of samsara and nirvana.
Yes.
And the way that the dependent nature appears to us is by way of the imagined nature, which it also argues. To the extent that the dependent nature appears to us as an imagined nature, that way we start to believe that causes and conditions are self-existing, or conditionality is self-existing, then still it is an object it is an afflicted object creating an afflicted mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so in and of itself, understanding conditionality is a good start, but it is incapable of removing the fundamental cognitive fault that something might exist from its own side. And I think here also, when you take out the sutra from the layers of later interpretation, for example, by Stiramati, then the criticism of Chandrakirti also falls away, because this interactivity between these three natures clearly shows that from a conventional side, we say that everything is dependently or originating, but that sentence is misunderstood by us because we understand it through our language, which then makes cause and effect into things again.
Yeah.
Which then we again form a basis for misunderstanding.
Or to take another way of, I hope, of saying the same thing, because I really liked what you just said, and I want to look at a slightly different way of seeing it. You could imagine somebody saying this: oh, gee, the imagined nature comes about through causes and conditions. So that's really the same as the dependent nature. And the imagined nature is the way the dependent nature appears to me. And since the dependent nature is empty with respect to production, all I have to see is the imagined nature. And now what I'm seeing is the true way that things are. And that's a terrible mistake, because what we have to see is not just that the imagined nature is the way that the dependent nature manifests, but that the dependent nature is in fact empty of that. And it's seeing the absence of the imagined nature in the dependent that becomes the object of purification. And
what is an interesting, maybe little interesting thing to add before we move on to a question, that in some of the expositions of how this is understood meditatively, it is out of this order. It starts often with a realization of impermanence, and impermanence as getting access to the dependent nature, seeing that things are constantly coming into existence and ceasing simultaneously. And so to become dissatisfied with phenomena that in the imagination initially seem to appear as being permanent and being able to sustain themselves, and noticing that they can't do that. And then in a second phase, objects are seen as products of the mind. And then finally, Vasubandhu in these 3 verses says, well, beyond that, you realize that in the absence of self-existing phenomena, a self-existing mind doesn't make any sense either. And then you end up in a comprehensive understanding of things not self-existing at all.
Yeah. Now, Richard, we promised we'd get to you, and we got to all 3 of these naturelessness. So now you're on.
Well, you answered my question.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's great. It was about how where does the consummate nature fit into this structure, and now I understand it. Thank you.
Right. It's really very pretty, isn't it? I think that the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra isn't just me being editorial now. I think it's one of the most beautiful Mahayana sutras. And we're only looking at 2 chapters of it, but the entire thing just fits together in such an elegant way. These 2 chapters in particular really put the Yogācāra position in a gorgeous way. Yeah, that's just me being editorial. So
there's one more question, Professor. From
oh,
Abelardo.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Who is it? I'm not seeing it.
It's me, Abelardo.
Okay, go for it, Abelardo.
Thank you. You were just saying, Professor Garfield, that how we create dualisms in our daily life, particularly how important or relevant this is, how we see the other person as an object, we objectify, reify them. I agree that that's the big issue, but also the way we relate to one another as people, as Martin Buber says, there's the I, there's the you, and there's the Tao, right? So I can see you as an object, but I can also see you as as a person with also a first-person perspective,
Yeah.
and where you have free will to let me into your subjective world, or just leave me out, so I can only go by my impressions of you. So there's so much that goes on potentially in an interpersonal subjective encounter, dialogue, love, for example, etc. But there must be reasons why evolutionarily speaking, from the point of view of evolutionary psychology, we've developed our mental apparatus, so we have these 2 kinds of perspectives. What do you think of this?
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and then I want to hear what Gendun thinks. So I've been thinking about this stuff a lot because of a book that I'm writing right now. Evolution is a cruel way to create organisms, because all evolution cares about, if you want to put it that way, is that we live long enough to reproduce and to assist our children in reproducing. And evolution has tuned us to be pretty good at that. It doesn't care that we get the world right. We're not truth detectors. We're not reality detectors. We're reproducers. And it doesn't care that we understand our own cognition. It doesn't care that we actually care about the offspring of people unrelated to us, because they may be competitors with us. And so we've evolved to detect in-groups and out-groups. We've evolved to see some people as instrumental to us and some people as the ones we ought to care about. We can understand these perfectly well in terms of the survival dynamics of hunter-gatherers in bands that are in competition with one another, but which are internally tightly knit in order to raise children together and get them to reproduce. Selective advantage does not require moral virtue. It doesn't require deep insight. It just requires strength and sexual prowess and longevity. And that's what we've evolved to have. The purpose of Buddhist philosophy is to get us to rise above that, and to be a little bit more than what we've evolved to be, to think a little bit more in terms of how we would like to be instead of what we've come to be. And I think that's really important to see. The very psychological processes that have allowed us to see others as as intimate others, allows us to see the ones more distant as distant others and as competitors. And those are the same evolutionary processes. The fact that they're evolutionary processes doesn't make them good. It just means that they've contributed to the survivors of our ancestors.
Yeah,
There's a Buddhist psychologist at one point said that the Dharma is perpendicular to evolution, in the sense that evolution will prioritize our reproduction over our happiness, and the Dharma will prioritize our happiness over reproduction. And I always make that as a joke, that I'm the pinnacle of that statement, as I don't produce anything at all as a monk. I think there's one thing to say about, I think, this idea of free will, and that might fall quite well, at least to some extent, in our discussion, as in a world in which everything arises dependently. Free will as a transcendental, alienated phenomena would not make any sense either. I think we can understand Buber in a Buddhist perspective, from taking a step back and realizing how much we are imputing on the other. And by taking that step back, bracketing what we are experiencing, creating the space in which we allow each other to unfold interdependently. So rather than having a preconception about who you are, in that dance of listening and speaking, see how we unfold together, and by that unfolding, learn something about each other and become hopefully interconnected in a more skillful and ethical way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm very grateful for both of your answers, and I conclude that this is an evolutionary challenge that we're in, and Buddha Dharma, of course, for me is a precious instrument for Dharma for this. So thank you. Yes. But it is a challenge, and this is something that we have to find a way to, I don't know, to universalize the Dharma, so that it becomes an evolutionary capacity to save humanity and planet Earth, I think.
Here's just another footnote to that, which may or may not be of any use or help. It's worth pointing out that we tend to think that we begin as first persons with self-consciousness, and then only later discover that other people are persons about whom we should care. And that's deeply false. And it's worth remembering that we begin to understand ourselves as second persons in the eyes of our caregivers, our mothers, our fathers, those who take care of us, and only gradually learn that we are first persons. And that ability to forget that we develop even our sense of who we are in intimate codependent relations is one of the saddest things about our psychology. And that's often reinforced by societies. So that if you grow up in the United States, for instance, I think one of the most poisonous ideologies is the one that we are independent individuals who each stand on our own 2 feet and have to learn to be independent and have to learn to fend for ourselves in a cold, hostile world. In a world where the market determines that competition is the only way to succeed. The moment you start talking like that, you've made it impossible to develop morally at all, or to have any kind of reasonable understanding of what it is to be a human being. If you have to stand on your own 2 feet, you have to make the ground on which you stand, make the leather for your shoes. Give me a break. Anyway, that's just me.
But well, it makes an important point in the sense that it highlights also the importance of what we're doing, because this is not only with regard to ourselves. We create an environment in which we provide our children with the conceptuality that will construct their imaginary nature. They will end up seeing this.
That's right. That's right.
They will end up with a world that appears to them like that, and that world is unskillful, is an unskillful basis for their intentionality, and they will end up failing. They will end up acting against their own benefit.
Yeah.
And I think that the resistance to sort of these dominant worldviews is very important.
Yeah. Ideology
What
matters,
you're-
determines experience.
What you're both saying is very important. I just, my last thought, right now we're seeing in so many countries this clash between the extreme neoliberal ideologies based on these egotistical assumptions you're talking about. And on the other hand, we have the climate change now and other polycrisis phenomena, and there's a split, a collective split and psychological in many people between these two worlds, these two realities. And if we're being led by half awake people, us blind people, to a precipice. Yeah, so that's my thought. Thank you.
We have a few more questions, Professor.
Sure, and then we'll move into the analogies. Yeah.
Okay, Venerable Drolma.
Hi, thank you. If you could clarify confusion for me, when we were going over the emptiness of the consummate nature,
Yeah.
the only thing I heard, and this is probably was definitely my own confusion. My understanding of the consummate nature is that it is the fact that the dependent nature is empty of the imagined nature.
Yep.
What's the difference between that and its non-nature? What's the non-nature of the consummate?
Okay. The emptiness, the ultimate emptiness of the consummate is the fact that the emptiness of, it's so hard to say this in English without the cascade of nested clauses. So I'm going to try to say it slowly.
Okay.
It's the fact that the emptiness of the imagined, of the dependent, of the fact that the dependent is empty of the imagined is the fundamental nature of the consummate, of the dependent, and means that ultimately it has no nature at all. That there is no nature we can assign to the dependent, because the only nature, the only positive nature it appears to have is the imagined nature. So when we see that the dependent is empty of the imagined, what we're seeing is that it doesn't have any nature at all. And the way that I like to put that is using the analogy, for instance, of the flower. And you ask, I don't want to know what the flower looks like to a person. I don't want to know what the flower looks like to a bee. I don't want to know what it looks like to a dog. I just want to know what it looks like. And it's coming to see that there is no way that it looks, that doesn't make any sense. And we often, so even today when I was teaching a class at local college, and we were talking about the fact that causal processes by themselves don't have any nature. And they say, but you have to be able to say something about it. And I say, so what can you say about it that is going to be independent of the way it appears to you? Give me a candidate, right? And nothing at all happens. So it's a seeing that it's not just that it lacks the imagined nature, it's that it lacks any nature at all. And that's what emptiness is in the ultimate sense. And when you see that, you see that the account of emptiness in this Saṃdhinirmocana tradition is no different from the account of emptiness in the Prajnaparamita tradition. That's why Je Rinpoche in Lekshe Nyingpo points out that any Madhyamaka can read the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra as a sutra describing the same emptiness that appears in the Prajnaparamita. It's because of that character of the ultimate emptiness.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes,
sorry for all
much.
the tripping over the nested genitives. It's so much easier to do this in Tibetan or Sanskrit than English. There's a reason that the Buddha didn't teach in English.
It highlights one other thing I think that's quite interesting, is that the realization of emptiness in the end is always characterized as inexpressible. This might be easily understood as somehow some unknowable transcendental thing. The point here being made is simply that here our language fails, because our language is part of the imagined nature.
Yes.
And so when we talk about the consummate nature, our words are getting in our way. Ultimately, the consummate nature is not expressible simply because the language that we use is part of our imagination. So we make, when we say emptiness, then what appears to our mind is a self-existing thing that is disconnected, in this case, from the dependent nature.
Yeah.
And so it becomes like a ground of all existence rather than something that, again, simply exists in dependence on other things. Because that is one of the arguments that is being made, that the consummate nature is also a dependent nature in the sense that it is simply a dependent origination.
Yeah.
And that's the
why
brilliance of the Sutra.
Yeah. Thank you.
You can walk endless circles until your mind gives up and becomes signless.
Yeah. And note that there are deep paradoxes lurking here, so that when we say that the ultimate nature is inexpressible, we've just expressed the fact that it's inexpressible.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
these
that's
paradoxes just start multiplying. And I think it's important to see that, because I think part of the imagined nature for us human beings is to think that the world is non-paradoxical, to superimpose a kind of comprehensibility and consistency on it. But the world didn't come to you comprehensible and consistent. It came to you a paradoxical mess. And we have a mind that doesn't really like paradox very much. So we recoil, and then we kind of fabricate a consistent but nonsensical character of the nature of reality.
In a way that also highlights an aspect of what it means to have a precious human rebirth, because our conceptuality is complex enough to recognize exactly that fact.
Yeah.
So we can run into, at one point, that was one of the aspects, one of the seeds in our continuum that will allow us to become Buddhas. At one point, we can recognize that there's something profoundly wrong with what seems to appear to us.
Yeah.
Because if the world existed as it appears, then for one thing, our actions should actually work.
Yeah.
And what I do should lead to happiness.
So now the sutra gives us a bunch of nice analogies. Oh, we have more questions?
We have more questions. Yes, Solange?
Professor Garfield, I go back on another note to the write-up by Longchenpa. And one of the things that I find is that in terms of purification, he goes even beyond simply stating that, effectively, right, that we purify, we are just purifying the imputed from the dependent. He goes even beyond that, and I'll read you this section over here. He talks, for example, he talks about the dependent nature as being of two types, impure and pure. Yeah. And he says this about the pure dependent nature. He says the pure dependent nature, on the other hand, refers to the pure Buddha fields, or to the pure fields, and all that appears within the sphere of the pure vision of the Buddhas, the Buddha fields, the seven precious things, luminous, unfathomable palaces, and so on. So one of the things I'm seeing, and by the way, this is just purifying the dependent nature. Then when he talks about the actual nature, again, he brings up the idea of this very deep purification. So which I'm not, I haven't read the Saṃdhinirmocana, but I'm curious, does the Saṃdhinirmocana go as far as that?
No. That's not to say that you can't comment on it to take it that far, and maybe you can, but we don't find that language in the Saṃdhi itself. Remember that Longchenpa is also writing from a Dzogchen perspective. And the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra is not being written from a Dzogchen perspective. Now, it's not to say that what Longchenpa's doing is wrong. I would never say that. It's that it's just a very different interpretative lens than one that you would find in a straightforward reading of the Saṃdhinirmocana. It's not to say that it's wrong. It's to say that he's doing something different with the text.
Okay, thank you.
But the simple concepts of that the dependent nature contains a purifying and an impure element is to be found there. And that is already implied in the Four Noble Truths. And the first two of the Four Noble Truths are dependent originations, and they are impure. the second part of the Four Noble Truths are the purifying. And so of all phenomena, the Four Noble Truths give a comprehensive description where the impure fall into the first two categories, and the pure or the purifying fall into the latter two categories. So one could say that Longchenpa elaborates on the second part of the Four Noble Truths, so the Four Truths for a Noble. So that would be one way to start exploring it.
And the other way to see it is just that the dependent nature seen through the imagined nature is the dependent nature, but impure. But the dependent nature seen as empty of the imagined is also the dependent nature seen as pure. Remember that, and this gets back to that fact that perikalpita and parinishpana are both past participles. They both indicate what the mind does to an underlying basis. The underlying basis is paratantra, the dependent nature. We can either see it in an imagined, impure way or a purified way, purified of the imagined. And again, that act of purification versus impurification, that's a strange word, are each things that we do to the dependent nature. Again, when we say mind only, what we're saying is it's only the mind that makes that difference between pure and impure. It's not the dependent nature itself. It's pure or impure depending upon how we engage with it, whether we superimpose the imagined nature or empty it of the imagined nature.
Thank you.
One last question for now, Nick.
Are the three lacks intended to be seen as sort of gradual levels of experiential understanding as well?
Yes and no. How's that for an answer?
That's fine.
Yes, in the following sense, that there is an order, and we'll see this when we look at the Trisvabhāvanirdeśa, in which we engage with the three natures. So we begin by seeing that the world we experience is an imagined nature and is empty with respect to those characteristics. Then we come to see, as a result of that it's merely a dependent nature, and hence the phenomena we see are empty in virtue of being produced. Then we see that dependent nature is empty of the imagined, and so see that the world that we perceive is ultimately empty. And those are successive levels of realization. Footnote, sometimes people debate, are the three natures in a pivot with the dependent nature as the foundation, and then either of the other two natures in terms of the way we see it, or are they in a succession? And the answer is both, right? Depending on whether you're talking about it metaphysically or in terms of order of realization. But so that's the yes answer. The no answer is these are all aspects of every objective experience. Every objective experience has the three natures. Every objective experience is empty in each of these three respects. So whether we recognize it or not, it's there, but it's also an aspect of our practice and recognition. And those aren't inconsistent with one another.
Thank you.
And did you want to clarify at all?
No, I think in all practicality, what I just said earlier, when one of the texts, and I don't remember now which one, it actually starts with, as I said, with working with the dependent origination, because impermanence is relatively accessible to us.
Yeah.
And so you could also say that these two distinct perspectives on these three natures and the three naturalists allow you also to go over them again and again. So to allow each three to deepen also your understanding of the individual ones. So you start with a superficial understanding, for example, by noticing that in contrast to what you believe, every moment of experience is very new. Every sense data is new in every moment, and therefore it highlights something of the inconsistency of the belief of permanence.
Yeah.
And that is imputed by language and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to the analogies because they're really nice. They're really helpful. The Buddha says, hey, Paramartha Samagata, for example, you can think of emptiness in terms of characteristic as being like the sky flower. That is, emptiness with respect to characteristic shows us that the characteristics that we think of as intrinsic to things don't exist at all in the same sense that a sky flower does. The redness that I think is in the apple doesn't exist at all, as opposed to the redness in my experience. And then he says, you can think of emptiness in terms of production as being like a magical apparition. Notice those are very different analogies. A magical apparition is a real positive thing that exists in one way but appears in another. That's super important. If you pay money to go to a magic show, you expect two things. One, you're going to see something that's unbelievable, and B, that it's really something else. So that if you see the magician saw the beautiful assistant in half, you don't want to see a murder. You want to see something that looks like it is, but isn't. If it doesn't look like it is, you say he's a lousy magician. But if it really is what it appears, you say he's a murderer. What you want is something that exists in one way and appears in another. That's the definition of an illusion. So when we say that the imagined nature is like a sky flower, we're saying that's something that doesn't exist at all. The dependent nature is something that does exist, but appears differently from the way that it does exist. Is that distinction really clear? That's super important. All of these analogies are subtly different from one another. And if we just think, oh, they're all examples of illusion, then you miss the important distinctions. Any questions about that first distinction? Okay. Then he says, ultimate emptiness is something other than those first two. It's not the sky flower. It's not a magic apparition. And he says, for example, just as space is just the absence of anything being in that space, and it pervades everywhere, ultimate emptiness is just the selflessness of phenomena and should be seen everywhere. And so when we said earlier in response to somebody's question, exactly what's the difference between ultimate nature, ultimate emptiness, and emptiness with respect to production? And we said the ultimate emptiness is the recognition that there is no characteristic there at all, a simple, complete lack of it being any way. The analogy there is when we see empty space, it's not just the absence of an elephant, not just the absence of a horse, not just the absence of a computer. It's the absence of any way of being at all. And it's that complete emptiness that gives us the analogy to ultimate emptiness. And he says, that's why Paramartha Samudgata, thinking of these three types of emptiness, that's why I said everything lacks any nature. Everything is empty of that. Questions about those three analogies? So we've got three different analogies now: sky flower, magic show, empty space. And that gives us the nature, the way to understand each of those three levels of emptiness. And the important thing to see is that every object of experience is empty in every one of those senses. Gendun, do you want to help me on this one? Any clarification?
No, I was more thinking in the sense of that these are different meditations. His Holiness refers to that in his commentary on Mahamudra. He says some forms of Mahamudra are of the second quality, where the magic show appears, but the practitioner also clearly sees that the magic show is empty. And the other one is the sheer appearance of the total space-like emptiness that pervades all phenomena. And so these are meditatively different perspectives, of which one is very applicable also in daily life, where the other one is very necessary in meditation in order to overcome the afflictive and cognitive obscurations in their entirety.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, they're very useful as to be applied in your daily life as well, in that sense. Also to know when you seem to be seeing a permanently existing phenomenon out there, or something that tastes in a certain way out there, then you know that doesn't exist at all. So that is a very easy way to relinquish.
Yeah.
At the same time, to to see the dependent appearing of things, and to realize that it is producing a magic show like phenomena is very useful. For example, I would say in an ethical context, because it leaves dependent origination intact and therefore gives a good basis for ethical conduct, where the pure dependent, where the realization of the consummate nation itself doesn't do that.
Yeah. And it's really, really important to see that these aren't choices. We don't say, well, is it really empty in terms of production? Or is it really empty in terms of characteristic? Or is it really ultimately empty? Everything is empty in each of these three senses.
Yes.
And that's the really powerful insight that we're getting from this discussion. Now, there's one last point that we need to make in order to complete the 7th chapter. And it's a very subtle point. And it's a subtle point about the relationship between the two truths. So the Buddha now says, we're in the middle of 103 in the English, 102 in the Tibetan. Hey, Paramata Samagata, something that doesn't exist in virtue of its own characteristic is unproduced. That which is unproduced doesn't cease. That which isn't produced and doesn't cease is peaceful from the very beginning, is a peaceful object from the beginning. That which is peaceful from the beginning is naturally in nirvana. That which is naturally in nirvana doesn't have any remainder. So thinking of emptiness in terms of characteristic, I taught everything is unproduced, unceasing, quiescent from the start, naturally in a state of nirvana. So this is connecting emptiness with respect to characteristic with this notion of the identity of samsara and nirvana. If we think of things as sources of suffering, we're thinking of them as having characteristics that make them sources of suffering. If we evacuate them or empty those things in our experience of those characteristics, then those things don't agitate us. They don't bother us. They don't cause us suffering. So the recognition of the absence versus the presence of characteristics is the difference between seeing something as a source of suffering versus seeing it as a source of liberation. Now, it's really important that when we recognize this, it's not that we're seeing two different things. One thing that's the apple that's a source of suffering and the apple that's a source of liberation. It's seeing the apple as a source of suffering versus seeing the apple as a source of liberation. Tsongkhapa puts this point very beautifully when he's commenting on Nagarjuna, when he says that the ultimate and the conventional are extensionally equivalent and intentionally distinct. Mobochikla dokpatada. So they're the same thing as an object, but completely different in the way that they are understood. And that's what we have here as an analysis of emptiness with respect to a characteristic. To see things as having their characteristics is to see them as sources of suffering. To see them as empty of those characteristics is to see them as doors to liberation. So he then does exactly the same thing with emptiness with respect to production in the next paragraph, and then with ultimate emptiness. And the paragraph on ultimate emptiness is quite lovely poetically. So I'm just going to read that with you. He says, the ultimate emptiness is distinguished by being the emptiness of all phenomena. And it abides in permanent time, everlasting time. The uncompounded reality of phenomena is free from all of the pathologies. That which is uncompounded, that which abides in permanent time and is eternal, due to this reality, is what we call uncompounded. Therefore, it's unproduced and unceasing, free from pathology, peaceful from the start, naturally in a state of nirvana. So each of these three emptinesses gives us a way of seeing things either as sources of suffering or as sources of liberation. And that is the account of the three natures and the three naturelessnesses that we find in the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra. So let me ask you again, do you have final words you want to say on this? Because we've got 5 minutes.
Yeah. That last beautiful quote actually nicely links back in an interesting way to this Longchenpa quote, by the way.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
one thing that I realized. So it does describe what Longchenpa does very poetically to an experience in which all grasping has ceased and the ultimate content of experience is peaceful and silent. By the way, this would also be nice to explore next week, how that combines to the awareness of the Buddha of the ways samsaric beings are still lost in their imagination. So how these two, how abiding in signlessness, not perceiving anything to be characterized from its own side, while seeing how beings believe in the appearances, abide simultaneously in the Buddha.
Yeah.
Because the sutra also makes it, because the sutra also criticizes and presents a hopeful perspective on the arahat. At one point says that he's not talking about Sravakas, but does accept that Sravakas are a certain stage in understanding this, that they seek first the peacefulness for themselves, rather than to re-engage in the way that phenomena appear to living beings.
Yep. And I want to finish with one point that's very nicely made in the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra, a part that I didn't think we were going to have time to get to, but we do. On page 119 in the English of the Powers, 118 of the Tibetan, there's a really nice point that's made about why we're teaching three natures and three naturelessnesses. The Buddha says, although people believe in this in the doctrine, they might strongly adhere just to its literal meaning. Then now he's talking about the second turning of the wheel texts. He's talking about the perfection of wisdoms. All phenomena just lack essence. All phenomena are just unproduced, just unceasing. Based on this, they develop the view that nothing exists and that characteristics don't exist. Once they think about non-existence this way and that characteristics don't exist, they deprecate everything by deprecating characteristics. They treat the conventional world as completely non-existent. Because they deprecate the imputational or the imagined nature, right? They deprecate that, saying, oh, it doesn't exist at all, it's just an imagination. They also deprecate the dependent nature and the consummate nature. I just want to underline that section because it is so much like chapter 24 of Mula Madhyamaka, where Nagarjuna says, if you deprecate the conventional, you deprecate the ultimate. Because if you don't recognize a conventional truth, then you don't recognize the basis for emptiness. And you don't recognize what the things are that are empty. And the fact that emptiness is the same as just being conventionally real. Here in the Saṃdhinirmocana, exactly the same point is being made. Exactly the same point. That we shouldn't say, oh, now we've seen the consummate nature. That means that the imagined nature and the dependent nature don't exist. No. The imagined nature does exist as the manifestation of the dependent. The dependent nature does exist as the thing that needs to be seen as empty of the imagined. And without seeing the imagined and the dependent, you don't get the consummate. You don't get to just jump to the consummate and ignore the other two. Deprecating those deprecates everything. So when the Buddha says, why am I teaching three natures? It's because you can't get the final nature without the other two. Why do I teach three kinds of emptiness? Because you don't get ultimate emptiness unless you understand emptiness with respect to characteristic and emptiness with respect to production. It's a package.
Exactly, as Tsukapa says in his Ode to Dependent Origination as well, that those that understand emptiness and dependent origination to be separated have not understood the Dharma. I think it also exactly points out why we keep needing to turn the wheel of Dharma, because reification or nihilism is around every corner, even within the Buddhist tradition.
That's right. And
so we need to refer. Please.
And reification of one thing always amounts to nihilism about something else.
Exactly. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But it also, and that nicely turns back to that quote from Rangtong that you gave earlier, which I think is a very healing one, is that the ultimate understanding is already included in the first had what we call the first wheel of the Dharma, which is held in the Pali Canon, which is complete in of itself, but over time became the victim of reification in part of the Abhidharma literature, which necessitated then Nagarjuna's explanation, which then was often misinterpreted in a very nihilistic way, which required the third turning wheel of the Dharma to balance it. And this is a very ecumenical way of looking at these traditions rather than deprecate them as being hierarchical in one way or another.
Exactly.
As being mutually complementary rather than being mutually exclusive.
That's right. And I'll come back. Anybody who says, oh, I'm a Mahayana practitioner, I'm too advanced to read the Pali Canon, is saying, I'm too good for Buddha Dharma.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't say that.
Yeah.
Would you like to take one last question, Professor?
We can take one last question together, and then we'll say goodnight for tonight.
Okay, Richard.
So Richard.
I don't know if I have a profound question, but I'm having trouble with the analogy and its relationship to existence in terms of how we distinguish a sky flower from a magic show.
Okay.
Those particular examples are extreme, and I can certainly distinguish between those two, but a lot of things in real life are a little bit more complicated than that. And I'm wondering what exactly is meant by existence in this context.
Okay. You're right that in the Hurley
question for now, then let's back.
No. You're right that in the hurly-burly of life, it's not always clear to us whether we're seeing a sky flower or a magic show. And the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra doesn't give you a recipe for figuring out which it is in every situation. But we know what the difference is between a sky flower and a magic show. And what this does is it opens us to asking that question. When I'm interacting with somebody else and I find myself getting really irritated by them for some reason, and I say to myself, oh, this person is really annoying, I need to ask myself, is this a sky flower or a magic show? That is this person really manifesting in one way, but actually having a different nature? Or am I just completely superimposing and imagining something, right? That's a useful question to ask myself. I don't have a recipe for figuring it out, but boy, it's really useful.
I think the pragmatic, that's a very pragmatic answer, and I think actually that's terrific.
Yeah.
That answers how I want to use this.
Sometimes one of the most valuable things about Buddha's texts to me is a diet of analogies, images, and examples that I can kind of stockpile for use in unpleasant situations. When I discover that I am suffering from a pathology, whether it's a pathology of attraction or aversion or anger or impatience or whatever it is, I always figure that I am seeing things in the wrong way. And then I can sort of go to my little catalog of analogies. Is this a mirage? Is this a plantain tree? Is this a bubble? Is this an echo? Is this a sky flower? Is this a magic show? And try to figure out the best analogy to help me diffuse the situation. And that stock of metaphors is so useful.
Of course, also a way to work with it is that the imaginary nature will definitely not sustain the non-existent aspect of the imaginary nature will not sustain analysis.
Yeah.
And so the belief that something that the person that you were angry with is inherently angry permanently is easily to defeat. It's just a matter of observation, wait 5 minutes and the anger is gone. That the apple is inherently delicious, you can defeat by yourself by keeping eating them and see if that is indeed the case or that something else is appearing.
Trying to feed it to your dog.
And so the belief that the apple is inherently delicious is definitely a sky flower. That the deliciousness arises independently from us as a mammal, that would be a magic show.
That's right.
because the deliciousness definitely does arise, but in dependence on my perspective, my individual perspective as a mammal.
Thank you. That's helpful too. Thank you.
So
Thank
now
you very
so
much.
thank you and good night. And next week we'll be reading
you.
Vasubandhu's Trisvabhāvanirdeśa, which is a masterpiece of philosophical
Yeah.
poetics.
One of the high
Thank you
points
so
of
much.
Sanskrit literature.
Absolutely. Gendun,
Thank you
thank
very-
you so much for joining me in this expedition. I so enjoy working with you.
The pleasure is entirely mine. Thank you.
I promise you it's not.
we share the pleasure. Exactly.
can share
The
it.
hallucination. Yes. Yes.
Good
And-
night,
and
all.
Well, and
We thank
none of
both
this
of
would have
you.
arisen without the listeners, because
Exactly.
we
Exactly.
would not have told the story about the sutra without the excellent questions that came our way.
Exactly.
This was a wonderful dance, and may it be of benefit to living beings.
Yeah. Thank you all. And
Thank
good
you
night.
very
everyone.
much.
you.
See you all next
Bye-bye.
week.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining in.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.